Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There's so many things we all want to talk about and share about, and sometimes, as members of Congress, we run in front of microphones and we sort of do the shiny, loud object of the day because, let's face it, that gets us retweets and Facebook and those things. But they're often trite. So I have a handful of things I want to walk through, but there's going to be a constant theme here. And I'm not trying to be mean, but the theme really is, and I think my facts will back me up, that the Democrat policies, if you look at particularly the last 12 months, have made life more miserable for Americans, have made working class and poor working class poorer, and actually are crushing sort of the hope. So I want to walk through a couple economic things. I'm blessed to be the senior Republican on joint economics. So a handful of economists that work for our side. There's a handful that work for the left side. And we've been digging and digging and digging, trying to understand the inflation data, the amount of cash that's chasing goods, what's happening in productivity. And dear Lord, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm starting to see numbers that look like we are on the cusp of a wage price spiral. And let's sort of walk through our basic economics. You all remember your high school economics class, particularly those of us who are old enough to have been in high school in the end of the 70s. Businesses raise prices because their costs are going up. You hit typically, just like we're doing right now, the new year, people are getting their wage hikes. Many of those wage hikes, most of those wage hikes are nothing more than to keep up with inflation. So you end up with this spike. So there was a handful of folks on the Democrat side that were saying, well, look at the December number. It wasn't spiking as much as the previous months. Wait till you see the January numbers when the wages come in. And then you end up with this world saying, well, now businesses, organizations, government, others have to keep raising their costs, raising their prices, raising their taxes, others, to keep up because they just had to raise wages, not for our brothers and sisters who are out there working to live better, but basically to just be able to purchase the same things. Except at the end of 2021, Americans were poor. The fact of the matter is the average American fell about 2.7 to 3% poorer because inflation grew faster than their wages did. But there's lots of things in the economic literature, and I know I'm geeking out a bit, that you start to end up in this seesaw effect they call a wage price spiral. Well, businesses keep having to raise their costs because now they have to raise the wages, and it becomes a very, very ugly circle. And a bit of trivia. How many here would immediately say, well, go back to the 1980s, particularly the early 1980s, it was Paul Volcker jacking up interest rates to just extraordinary levels that squeezed out inflation. That's actually only part of the story. If you actually look at the math, during that time, there were the Reagan tax cuts, the first round of them. And they created a great spike in productivity. Because one of the things inflation is once again, I have too much money chasing too few goods. So raising interest rates, making everything more expensive, still doesn't do anything to make sure you're making more goods, more services to fill up that vacuum to remove that inflationary pressure. And you actually even see some of that data after we did tax reform here at the very, very end of 2017. When you saw this spike in productivity, you saw actually a really pretty impressive spike for 2 years of wages and actually falling inflation. And why was that? It's because expensing and other things we did in tax reform, repatriation getting billions, hundreds of billions of dollars coming back from around the world back into the country, actually raised productivity, lowered prices. That's the holy grail. And right now, almost every policy that the administration, and I hate to say this body is engaging in, are counter to that. So we're going to walk through a couple things here, and our argument is really simple. Almost every major policy set being moved forward, and I don't think it's purposeful. I think it's just a misunderstanding of the most basic economics that my Democrat brothers and sisters are doing, is actually making life more miserable. And I don't think it's purposeful, but it is economics. So let's walk through the facts, just the actual math. And I know this is always uncomfortable, but if you actually look at the data that came in, it's actually, when you look at the expenditures, because I'm using this slide, this is actually a 2019 slide, but it's important to set the base. Our brothers and sisters who are on the lowest quartiles, and I hate that term, but it's what we use as economics, dramatically more of their income goes to pay for housing. Dramatically more goes then to pay for their transportation, their food. Those in the upper incomes, that's not where they live. And think about what's gone on in this last year. And most everyone that's in this room, probably most everyone who's watching this, we're the people who have savings. We have retirement accounts. We have 401ks. Life has gotten more expensive for us, but our assets, how many of you have a home that's gone up dramatically in value? Think about those lower income quartiles, that working poor, that middle class, that lower middle class. Do they have a home? Are they renters? How much of their cost is their transportation, just trying to provide housing? What we've allowed to happen inflation-wise is just brutalizing them. And when you actually start to understand what the policies from this last year have done, and I'm going to show a number of these things showing that the left's policies are actually crushing the poor, the working poor, and the middle class. The difference here when you see this type of graph is we're trying to sort of demonstrate that it's both the effects on populations where you are income-wise. If you're in this lower income, how much more your cost of your life is because of inflation. So this is almost just a pure inflation of who benefits, who doesn't benefit. So if you're a homeowner, if you're someone with lots of assets and the stock market's been really good to you, you've turned out ahead. If you are like most in the middle class and lower, your standard of living has gone down. And there's this rule of thumb. From the top line, what are the two things you do to make the working poor poorer? I've said this dozens of times behind this microphone. It's inflation, and it's opening up the border. There is this economic theory, and this is actually old literature. It's like 20 years old, and it actually had a number of left groups as part of the authors who basically said, if you look at the working poor, this is a population who probably didn't finish high school. What they sell is their labor, their willingness to work, their willingness to sweat. What happens when you flood your society, functionally in 1 year, with a couple million people with similar skill sets? You know, it's just basic math. You functionally have devalued the economics, the value of their labor. So you've given the double whammy. You've created inflation, which affects the poor and the middle class more dramatically, because you saw from the first chart how much more of their resources go to pay for housing, to pay for transportation, to pay for food. And now you make them compete against a couple million people with similar skill sets. You know, these aren't IT jobs. This isn't someone who is at the top of the wage scale and creates a multiplier of productivity in the society because they're inventing some new app. This is the person who's hanging drywall, working their hearts out. It's a tough job. Their back is aching at the end of the night. And now they look out and there's a couple of million other people in society with similar skill sets. It's a level of misunderstanding that what some folks will come behind these microphones and pretend they're being compassionate, not understanding the cruelty of inflation and having an open border, and how many working poor are getting crushed on this. But I want to go a bit further. So as you start to look at the inflation level, you got to understand, 7% was sort of the national number, right? In markets like mine, in the Phoenix area, we're at 9.7% inflation in 2021. So now a lot of that's because I'm from a growth area. Lots of people are abandoning the Californias and the Illinois and moving into my neighborhood. So much of my inflation is actually housing. You know, we've already heard other people come behind the mics even today and talk about the cost of housing. Well, congratulations. In other parts of the country, it's not 7%. In mine, it's 9.7%. And when we look at the charts and the details, it really, really has hurt the working poor. And they're having trouble finding the most basic accommodations. And then we start to dig in more. And the economists have made it very clear that what was allowed to go on in 2021, and it's the economics warn of inflationary inequity. And the details are pretty clear. For those of you who have assets, you're going to do okay. If you're part of half of America that doesn't have those few $1,000s in the bank, or owns the house, or has the other assets, you've become poor. The policies are making you poor. And I know this is uncomfortable, but you can't keep campaigning and doing politics and saying, we care about the middle class, we care about the working poor, and then keep adopting policies that make them poorer. At some point, the math always wins. Not the virtue signaling, not the rhetoric, it's the math. And we're making half of our country poor. But one of the other projects we're working on in the Joint Economic side, and a couple of us on the Ways and Means Committee, is also trying to understand what other attributes are there. You know, I can keep coming to the microphone and talking about the open border, and we have an administration that doesn't seem to give a darn because it's political. Their base has no trouble with a couple million undocumented folks coming into the country. Inflation is really, really ugly because the math is brutal. Do you have any sense how high interest rates have to go to squeeze out this inflation? I think there's this fantasy that 4 marginal rate increases this year somehow are going to tap down inflation. I will make you a crazy, actually it's not crazy, it's based in math. At the final quarter of this year, you may be seeing 10% inflation. And I hope I'm wrong, but I was in front of this mic a year ago saying, I think we're going to be close to 7, and I actually underestimated it. And go back to my opening comments. I really, really, really see in the numbers, we're on the cusp of a wage price spiral, and 4 marginal quarter-point increases in interest rates ain't going to cut it. Unless Congress dramatically starts to think about policies that spike productivity. Except you have a left that now it's an article of faith that tax reform, that expensing, these things we did in the tax code to bring back hundreds of billions of dollars back into the country, to get organizations to invest in plant and equipment to make workers more productive so they could be paid more. Well, we can't do that. Except even the liberal economists agree it worked. And it turns out you need to be doing things like that. The left's Build Back Better social spending bill, because it delinks money transfer payments from work, every data set basically says it will continue to spike inflation, and at the end of 10 years, I came here with the paper. It makes it very clear at the end of 10 years, the working poor are poorer. because the way the left has designed these transfer payments without an expectation of participation in society and work. I thought we learned this 25 years ago, but somehow math is heresy. So let's go, what are some of the other attributes that make our brothers and sisters in that lower middle class, working poor, in many of our neighborhoods, what else makes them poor? Okay, we've touched on inflation. We've touched on flooding society with millions of people with similar skill sets. When was the last time you had someone remind us that the concentration of crime, for most of the members in this body, we don't live in neighborhoods that are going to be subject to crime. How many members here live behind a gate? How many members here have security? I did a ride-along for 4 hours on Monday through north central Phoenix. And neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood, the officer I rode with had almost like 28 years on this City of Phoenix police force. And it was the neighborhoods that were most disadvantaged had the most crime. We're driving away, okay, there's an assault here. You see the person in that apartment, they're a drug dealer. And you're realizing it's the folks who are in poverty are in the core of the crime. And then the left takes a position of basically having verbal violence towards law enforcement. But we know the data says, if you look at the concentrations of poverty, one of the attributes that makes someone poor is when someone comes and steals their stuff. You're trying to work, someone steals your tools. You're trying to survive, someone breaks into your car or steals your automobile. It's another attribute that, once again, the left's policies is like this constant economic violence on the poor. And then you start to go on another thing we're working on. This one's much more complex, but it's starting to prove the theory's true. How many of you have ever heard the discussion about health disparities? You know, our urban poor, my Native American populations, even rural poor, the health disparities. And it's absolutely true. Our brothers and sisters with renal failure, diabetes, these things, who are concentrated, we can almost draw data circles around them and say, look at the income inequality of this neighborhood to a neighborhood it might be just down the street. And we've been trying to understand what are the attributes. And oddly enough, some of the attributes aren't race. They're health. They're crime. They're education. But the one that no one here has focused on is actually health. If you ever get a chance, and this is for anyone that's listening, try to find the data of those who are suffering type 2 diabetes and the concentration. Go find a heat map. And it becomes a really interesting discussion, because that's I'm making is my fourth attribute, is our brothers and sisters who are sicker. So the left's attitude is, well, it's good politics, we'll just put up a bunch more clinics. We'll help them manage their diabetes. Okay, that's an honorable thing. Wouldn't it be much more compassionate to cure, to disrupt? So we do know, because it came out a year ago, but it's as if no one actually read it. We actually have the paper that was put together, a working paper series, Congressional Budget Office. It was functionally some of the data within the Democrats' H.R. 3. And if you actually dig through the numbers within their working paper, it makes it clear that the Democrats, it's great politics. Hey, we're going to lower drug prices. But the way they go about doing it, a decade from now, so many cures don't come. And as the paper talks about, it's the very cures for things like potentially diabetes and other ailments that are concentrated in our poor population. So it's functionally the left's policy on something like H.R. 3, because if you think about their pricing mechanism where, you know, if a drug costs more than this amount of money, you can't have it. it's once again policy that says we're going to find a way for you to live with your misery, but we're going to make your living with your misery a little cheaper. Then I think the thing that's loving and more compassionate is we're going to find a way to cure it. It really is a different mindset, and that isn't Republican or Democrat. It's just compassion. But it may not be great politics. Because the fact of the matter is, if you look at the mechanics within H.R. 3, the Democrats actually make big pharma more profitable and bigger and more powerful, and they wipe out the disruptors, the small biologics, the small pharma that's actually chewing away their book of business because they're curing the disease where big pharma over here is just maintaining it. It's the classic economic irony of this place acts like a protection racket. We give great speeches on how we're going to do this, and then wink, wink, nod, nod. What actually is happening is you're locking in someone's oligopoly. And once again, if you go through the paper, it makes it really clear that the first couple of years, not much difference because it's what's already in the disruptive pharmaceutical pipeline. And we've done presentations here of, 100 new are under research and only a few actually succeed. But in about 5-6 years, you start to see a collapse of those cures. Welcome to Democrat policy once again. And we've come to the floor multiple times with H.R. 3. We've made a number of people very angry by referring to it as the Big Pharma Protection Act. But the math is the math. And now you still have additional CBO studies that make it clear we're telling the truth. It is what it is. And we've actually made proposals to our brothers and sisters on the left saying, we both are enraged at the price of pharmaceuticals. Believe it or not, there's other ways to get there. And one of the most magical things we could do for society is also some of the kickers to make sure that there's capital stacks and these other things that are a little geeky, but ways that that investment goes into the cures. So when you have things like a single-shot cure for hemophilia, when you saw, I did this presentation back in December, we have a proof of concept of a cure for type 1 diabetes. These are going to be, starting, they're going to be really expensive. They're going to be really difficult until we functionally turn it into a biofoundry and you build the capital stack, the tax code, the incentives to do lots of that. But I can show you in chart after chart, it saves society, it saves taxpayers a fortune in the future. Remember, last year's CBO math said in 29 years, we are $112 trillion in debt in publicly borrowed money in today's dollars. So that's inflation-adjusted dollars. And we know that number is going to spike once we get the math from this last fiscal year plugged in there. About 75% of that spending is just Medicare. That debt is Medicare. The other 25% is Social Security. The most powerful thing you can do for U.S. sovereign debt is disrupt the price of health care. And our argument is the greatest elegance is actually doing it by making people healthier. There's one other, I want to throw my frustration of Democrat policy. And my expertise is more Arizona and not the rest of the country. We've seen the debate around here, lots of flowery words and almost no detail of the reality of what's underlying the piece of legislation. Our friends on the left will come behind the microphones and say it's a Voting Rights Act. Okay. How is giving a politician 6 to 1, so you give me $200 and the Treasury is going to multiply it by 6 times? Is that defending democracy, or is that, once again, the left being so much smarter than Republicans are on how to try to stay in power? How about some of the other things that are in the Democrats' H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, their federal election bill? And my theory is a little different than other folks. It's just a blatant power grab. And it's not a power grab for the federal government, which it is that, but it's much more than that. It's a power grab by a party. that basically is trying to design the election code to fit their fundraising model, their campaign model. So it does other things, like down here, my state for functioning 18 years has had voter ID laws. Every data set out there says you can't find a differential of populations not being able to vote. Matter of fact, I think in my state, some of the underlying data is African American females are the highest participation. It's actually white males, particularly white rural males, that have some of the lowest participation, and some of my Native Americans. But that doesn't meet the folklore that we get from our brothers and sisters on the left. But think about this. And this is the circle I want folks who are paying attention to get their heads around how it works. So the Democrats push a voting rights bill, but it's really about voting mechanics. And what they do is they say, hey, we're going to have same-day automatic registration. And then we're going to legalize, industrialize ballot harvesting. And then at the same time, we're going to do this so they also are allowed to have, if you give them money, they get 6-1. So why would you do that? Well, first off, as in California, the Democrats have built a huge infrastructure. If you run for Congress, you actually take a substantial portion of your campaign money and hire firms that go knock on doors and harvest ballots. It's now a campaign mechanic. Well, what happens if you hire lots of people to go walk through that massive apartment building or this and that and knock on the door and say, hey, I'll register you right here, let's do your ballot. That's functionally what they're doing in this legislation. And the beauty of it, it will ultimately be taxpayers who will be financing it, because the left, to their credit, has spent about the last 15, 20 years building an online contribution system. And here's the kicker. That online contribution system has trained contributors to the left, contributors to Democrats, to say, don't give one person this much money, give 10 people this much. And it's as if it's always been laid out that saying, and wink, wink, nod, nod, one day, we're going to set up a public funding system so your $25 contribution or $200 contribution gets multiplied 6 times. I mean, you got to give the left, you got to give the Democrats credit. They're just audacity. And then to call it a civil rights voting bill, when you break through its mechanics, it's about power. It's about power and control. That's what this is. And the other beauty is handing the bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C., the functionality of saying, they can tell my state of Arizona what's allowed and what isn't allowed. We have a family saying that goes, money, power, vanity, but most of the time it's about the money. In this case, I got to give the left credit. They hit all 3 in the same piece of legislation. You know, it becomes about the money, it becomes about them keeping the power, but reality has almost nothing to do with fairness. It's about the fear that the public understands how much of the left's policies have been crappy to them, their families, this country, and the mechanism they're going to try to keep in power is to functionally have us finance their elections and allow them to industrialize the very bad acts that so many of us worry about. And with that, Madam Speaker, I think I feel a little better getting some of that out of my system, so I yield back.
The gentleman yields.